Hey nerdy knitters, welcome to another episode of the Nerdy Knitting Podcast. Get your favorite beverage and your knitting and let's settle in for a good chat. I was scrolling through Facebook the other day and ran across a picture from Very Pink Knits. She was comparing different needle tips and tapers, all of the different brands, Knitter's Pride, Knitter's Knit Pro, Chowgu, Haya, a bunch of different ones. And she was showing the tips and the tapers. Now the tips of course refers to the very tip of the needle, how sharp or how blunt those are. Sometimes you might want a sharp tip, sometimes you might want a more blunt tip. And then there's also the taper of the needle, and that refers to that bit of the needle at the end that gets to that final point. It's narrowing down from the barrel of the needle to the very tip of the needle, and some of those can be quite long, and that can affect your knitting. And there are tapers that are more short, and that can affect how your knitting ends up too. So all of these different things can go into how your actual knitting project might turn out depending on the needles you use, the tips, the tapers, even the material of the needle. So if you're interested to just see a picture of the comparison of those tips and tapers, then I put a link to that. But you can also check on her Instagram. She just did an updated picture because the picture I saw was from a few years ago. And I guess there was so much interest in it that she went ahead and did an updated picture with some more different needle brands that are out now. So just find her on Instagram if you're interested in that one. I'll post the one that I saw, but you can always look for the other one on Instagram as well. So it's really neat to compare the different tips and tapers. And if you already have a favorite brand and you're thinking about buying some other needles as well, then that might give you some insight into what you're looking for. Like my favorite that I use all the time are my Chowgus, which have a pretty long taper and a fairly sharp tip. So I might, if I want to invest in other needles, I probably don't want to get the same exact types of tips and tapers. I might want something a little more blunt for other projects, especially when you have a yarn that splits really easily. You want something that's a little more blunt and is not going to split that yarn as much. So it's interesting to see all of the different yarn needles anyway, or knitting needles. So you can go check that out. And on the subject of knitting needles, I had a poll last week about people's favorite types of needles, if they prefer fixed circular needles or interchangeable circular needles. So if you'd like to weigh in on that poll, I'll put a link to that so you can go just click on whatever box you prefer and share some more information about what you like. I was really surprised. I thought there would be more people who would prefer interchangeables. Probably, well, I do. I think most of it is because of like the cost effectiveness. It's just much cheaper to have a set of interchangeables in the long run. But there are times when you want some fixed circulars. I like them for sock knitting, and I am thinking about getting some for sweater knitting. I knit a lot of sweaters and usually in like a sport DK weight yarn, so I might start getting some fixed circulars for sweater knitting. I'm thinking about that, just so I always have that size on hand for any sweater projects because, well, I don't know how many knitting projects you have on the go at one time, but sometimes if I have more than a few projects, I need those tips for other projects as well. And I could always buy more tips, I suppose, but it's nice to have some fixed circulars. Sometimes when I find an author that I like, I tend to read all of their books. And right now that seems to be Agatha Christie. I've finished almost all of the Miss Marple books, working my way through the Poirot series, and to fill in, I'm reading some of the short stories and the other books. And of course, I love to find them on TV or different streaming services. We just signed up for a free month of BritBox to give that a try. And we just watched Why Didn't They Ask Evans this weekend? And I really enjoyed it. I have not read that story yet, so I don't know how it compares. What I don't like is when they take a story and change it so much that you don't even recognize it anymore. And we just watched Death on the Nile a few weeks ago, and that's how I felt about that. I have read that book and I really liked it, and I didn't like how they changed the characters. The story was really good the way it was. I thought their changes were unnecessary, and honestly, I prefer David Suchet, his version of Poirot from, the 90s, I think, if you've ever watched the Poirot TV series, compared to Kenneth Branagh. I don't know how to say his last name, but I don't really like his version of Poirot. Not my favorite. But of the two, anyway, between Death on the Nile and Why Didn't They Ask Evans, I preferred Why Didn't They Ask Evans. It's a 3-part miniseries. It's very slow moving. The last episode does feel a little rushed when you finally get to the real meat of the mystery. But I like the way they build the characters in the world, and the dialogue is great, and there's some great actors and actresses in it. Emma Thompson has a small part. Hugh Laurie is in it. I think he also wrote the script or produced. I'm not quite sure, but I really like that. So if you have BritBox and you like British TV shows, then that might be something to check out. It's only a 3-part series, but it's really, I thought it was very well done. I really enjoyed it. So we have a lot of knitting questions to get through this week, so we're going to get right to it. Our first question is from Natalie. I'm wondering about different types of knitting cast-ons, particularly what are called I-cord cast-ons, where you knit a long cord and pick up stitches and knit them. So an I-cord, for those who aren't familiar with it, is just a long strip of knitting. It can be maybe 3 stitches, 4 stitches, it could be even more, but you would knit the stitches, and then instead of turning your work and knitting again, you just slip them back to the right needle, to the left needle, not the right needle. You slip them back to the left needle, and you sort of bring that yarn around across the back and pull it tightly a little bit and knit them again. And then of course they're on your right needle because you've knit them. So you slip them back to your left needle. You never turn your work, and it creates this long cord, an I-cord as it's referred to. I believe this was invented by Elizabeth Zimmerman. Not quite sure though. But then there are also ways to work an I-cord edge, where you are doing basically the same thing. You are knitting those stitches on one row and then slipping them on the next. So you get this section of elongated stitches basically. And when you have it at each edge, you get an I-cord edge. And you can also use this to cast on and to bind off. Now, the standard way to do an I-cord cast on is to start with your I-cord, and then you work an increase. That becomes like the first row of your knitting. And then you repeat working your I-cord and add another increase stitch. And as you go along, this adds the stitches that you need to start your project and gives you that I-cord along the bottom. The problem with this method is that stitches are wider than they are tall. So when you're trying to squeeze these wide stitches in this direction, and you've got your stitches running, your I-cord running this way, well, anyway, the gauge doesn't work out. It's not, because the rows going across the bottom in this direction, the gauge might be different for each stitch compared to the stitches that are going vertically across the top. You have that first row of stitches worked out. So this can make that I-cord either too tight and it sort of buckles in, or it could splay out. There's lots of issues with this. So another method for doing an I-cord cast on is to create the I-cord as long as you need for your cast on edge. And then when it's done, it's sort of like a garter tab or something like that. You turn it 90 degrees and you pick up a stitch along the side. So you get the I-cord there, and then you're picking up and knitting a stitch from each of those. But what makes this one a little better is that you don't have to pick up a stitch for every one of those I-cord stitches. So depending on your gauge, you could like skip one every 5 stitches or every 7 stitches, or skip 2, you know, for if you have a gauge of 5 stitches to 7 rows or something like that. But it gives you more control over that ratio of stitches to rows. But there is, let me see, I think that's everything that I wanted to say about it. Okay, yes, but there is, Suzanne Bryan has done a series of video really exploring I-cord in depth, and she has one that talks about these different I-cord cast on methods and walks you through both of them and why she prefers the second method. So I will link to that, and hopefully that addresses your question, Natalie, so you can learn more about the I-cord cast on. Now, our next question. In last week's video, we talked about crescent and top-down triangle shawls and how sometimes you can get that weird bump in the middle, like when you're blocking it out, that top edge doesn't want to be completely straight. Where you cast on, you might get this weird shape because of the extra fabric or something like that. But somebody left a great comment. We had some tips that we shared last week, and Joyce left a comment. She said, I'm not really fond of the garter tab cast on, but I've come to realize it definitely has an important function. I really like the construction of crescent shaped shawls, so I figured I had better find a way to get along with this process. What I'm using is cast on 3 stitches, which is generally the normal for that. But instead of knitting the 6 or 9 rows, she's knitting 18 rows. She ends up picking up 9 stitches along that long edge, 1 from each garter ridge. And then she picks up the 3 stitches from the cast on edge. So what she's doing is making quite a long tab, which allows her to pick up a lot more stitches. Usually it might be you're only picking up 3 or 4 stitches along that edge, but she knits it long enough so she can pick up 9 stitches, which gives her more stitches right away. So that might be another way to combat that weird hump at the cast on edge. So it's something worth testing. If you run into that problem and you really dislike how your crescent shawls are turning out, then you might want to try to cast on more stitches using that garter tab. But of course, if you're working something that has a specific stitch pattern, then this might be a little more difficult. But if you can work out like the stitch multiple, you might be able to get away with it. But it'll involve a little bit of math, but it's worth exploring for sure. We've also been having a great discussion about how to block acrylic yarn, especially when you're working a project in pieces. I'm knitting a sweater for my daughter right now, a cardigan. So I've got the front and the back, all the pieces all done, but they are curled up, you know, like, because they're just plain stockinette. And if I had done them in wool, I could just soak them and pin them out and they would be pretty flat. But I've never knit a sweater or a cardigan in acrylic yarn before. So I wasn't sure the best way to block that, to get it to lay flat so I could seam it. So we've had lots of advice. Some people say they skip it all together. Some people say that they do wet it and then pin it out and then it dries flat enough so that they can seam it. And I've even had some tips about steaming it lightly, but that one still makes me a bit nervous. But we have another tip from Nicole. She says to check out the podcast, It's All in a Nutshell. Esther's a crocheter. She uses a lot of Scapia's yarn. It's spelled Scheepjes, but I looked it up. I think it's pronounced Scapia's. And they often have acrylic in that brand. And she wet blocks before seaming. So I think I was going to skip it all together and just seam it the way it is. But the 2 front pieces are just like, they're just little tubes. They curled up so much. So I think it's really going to be a pain to seam those. So I'm going to, I think, sometime this week, or I might wait till I'm almost on the sleeves because I don't want to leave them sitting too long. They might curl back up. I don't know. But I think I'm at least going to like get the front pieces wet and pin them out and see how that works out. And then I'll decide if I want to do the back as well. But it's another great tip. And of course, any of the things we talk about, I love it when you share your comments and I share them here so we can all learn new knitting things, new knitting tools to add to our knitting toolbox. Then next is a question from Masuga. She wants to know about armpits. When you have a top-down sweater like Flax from Tin Can Knits, and I feel like when I pick up underarm stitches, they can look so sloppy. I wasn't sure if there were tips or tricks to helping this not only look better, but go a bit more smoothly. Okay, first of all, I think it's picking up in the correct spot. You have to really look at the knitting. So turn it so it's facing you the way you're going to pick up the stitches, which is probably upside down compared to the way you knit it, I think, depending on which direction you knit. Anyway, you're going to have to pick them up. So you turn it so it's laying there, so the way you want to pick up the stitches. And then you look for the columns of V's. Each of those columns represents a row or a column of knitting. Each of those V's represents a stitch. You're not looking for the upside down V's, you're looking for a V. And look right at the top where you probably cast on a few stitches. And what you're going to do is pick up right in the middle of the V between the legs of the stitch. You insert your needle there, wrap the yarn, pull it through. That's the proper place to pick up the stitches. So if you say you cast on 3 stitches, when you turn it over, you're probably going to want to pick up 4, just because the way it's going to lay. You'll have to lay it out and look at your project and see how many columns of those stitches you see running up there. And it's all right if you pick up more than the designer says in the pattern. All you have to do is like knit them together with another stitch on the next row. I always err on the side of picking up a few more in that area and decreasing the way just to get rid of any holes. And another thing, this is something I learned from Suzanne Bryan. When I watched her video about perfect thumb gussets, and she also applies this in another way to underarms, and I'm going to link to her video as well, where she picks up the loops to either side and she knits them together and she twists them so it closes any holes It's hard to explain on here, so I will link to that, but it's actually the same method that I learned from her that I use on thumb gussets as well, where I pick up like the running bar between where I'm picking up stitches and the mitten fabric. I pick up that running bar, and then when I get to it on the next round, I reseat it on the needle so it's going to twist closed, and I just work it together with the stitch right beside it. And it's sort of the same process, so that eliminates any holes you might get. It's really a great technique, and I've seen it in other places, but the first place I saw was with Suzanne Bryan's video, so I'm going to link to that. Oh, and one more tip that I had on here. Now, as you're picking up, if you're picking up stitches and where you insert and you pull through and you see, oh, that's going to be a big hole, then just don't pick up there. It's okay if you skip a spot. Nobody's going to see that. So wherever, if it doesn't look the way you want it, then just take it out and do it again. You can do it multiple times. You're not going to ruin your knitting. Okay, so next question. Scripture for Women says, I want to make a large lace pattern shawl, but how do I write a pattern for it? So I feel like, I'm not sure if she wants to know like how to design and knit one for herself, or if she really wants to write a pattern that she can publish. So we're going to address both questions anyway. So if I were going to like design one to knit, I would start with a chart. I use Stitch Mastery, but any charting software would do. What I would do if I were going to do a lace shawl, and I know I'm going to have lace all over, is I would chart out the shape of the shawl first, as large as I can to see on my screen. You can always add more later on, or but chart out the shape first, like the increases and decreases and the no stitch boxes, just so you can see the shape of the shawl. And then I would take whatever stitch patterns I wanted to use and I would plug them into that shape. There's a couple different ways you can do this, like if it's depending on how many, the multiple of the stitches or the repeat or whatever, you can like don't start until you have enough stitches to allow for a full multiple, or fit in partial repeats of the pattern. I have a video that shows you 3 different ways to like put that shawl, the stitch patterns into a shawl shape, and demonstrating on a top-down triangle shawl, I think. So I'll put that here. But that is how I would do it if I were, that doesn't necessarily answer the question about writing a pattern for it, but if I were going to design a knit one, this is probably how I would do it. I would chart it out, and then your charting software is going to provide you written instructions once it's in there as well. So if you prefer to knit from written instructions, I think it's helpful still to create the chart because you can see how it's going to look. It's much harder just to write out the instructions and hope it works out. Well, at least for me, I would have to see visually how it's going to lay out in the shawl before I started knitting, but you can always use the written instructions that your software provides afterwards. Now, if you wanted to design something and then have it like as a complete pattern, then you've already done a lot of the work by charting it out and you've got your written instructions, but then you have all of the other details like figuring out your gauge, the needle size, how much yarn you're going to use, all of the other things that go into a pattern. And I would recommend that you just start reading lots of patterns to see what's included in them. And I would focus on people who have designed quite a lot and who have sold a lot of patterns, because I mean, let's face it, anybody can go online and publish a pattern now. Ravelry will let anybody, you know, design, like write a pattern and submit it either for free or for sale, and the quality can vary a lot. Like you can have simple pattern recipes that don't even have gauge information up to, you know, fully written out patterns in lots of different sizes and everything you'd need, tutorials and all of it. So there's a full range. So I can't say just go read lots of patterns because there's a lot of poorly written patterns out there. So to make it easier, I would look at designers who really publish a lot and have sold a lot of patterns. And you can tell when you see, like, go on Ravelry and see how many people have actually put up project notes, then you know that probably those patterns are more reliable, or look for patterns that have been tech edited. I just finished with the tech editor for the Color Adventure top-down triangle shawl. That'll be coming out in June. But you want, like, I'm a tech editor as well, but I don't want to edit my own work. I still have it sent and somebody else edits it. So I think that's an important part of selling a pattern. If you want to publish them, then that's something to consider, finding a good tech editor. But also another good resource for how to lay out a really good pattern would be Kate Atherley's The Beginner's Guide to Writing Knitting Patterns. I'll have a link to that down below as well. So if you want to turn your lace pattern shawl into a full-on design that you can sell, then that will walk you through how to like lay out a really good pattern. Then we have another question from Scripture for Women. I have a Barocco lace shawl knitting pattern and I'm stuck and have questions. What do you do when you buy a big company pattern and there's no one to ask for clarification? And then she has an example of what her issue is. So what's the solution? Okay, so it doesn't matter who sells the pattern. I did answer her directly, but I thought I would share this here too, because sometimes you find patterns on websites like Barocco or any of the yarn companies, and you can still contact them and ask them. They should have somebody on staff that can help answer your questions. So look for an email address, a contact us form on the website, and tell them you are having trouble with your pattern and you need some advice or some help, and they should hopefully get back to you and with the person who can help you with that. If not, or if you just want to figure it out for yourself, you could go to Ravelry, look for that particular design, and then go to see who else has knit the design and if they've left any notes. Sometimes people's notes are full of great tips and advice about how they've changed or altered or adjusted or fixed if there's mistakes. So that's another thing you can do, is to go look at the notes that people leave when they knit. And another thing I like to do is do a search for that pattern name and the word errata, because like there's been corrections or something that you've missed since like you've downloaded the file yourself, then that might pop up as well. If there were mistakes in the file or in the pattern, then that might have been updated. So you can always check that too. So there are some things to do. And then also, if that doesn't work, then there are plenty of Facebook groups where you can post like part of the pattern, not the whole pattern, but you can post like one little section of the pattern that you're having trouble with, and then knitters are more than willing to help each other. Facebook groups, there's groups on Ravelry, I'm sure. And if you're really stuck and need and you really want some one-on-one help, I do have a service I call Knitting 911, where you can fill out this form, send me some pictures and part of the pattern that's causing you trouble, and I can make you a video, and I upload it privately, so it's just for you. And this isn't free, this is a paid service. So if you're really stuck, or if you want to work on a skill and be more like a hands-on thing, then you can check that out as well. I'll try to remember to put a link, but it's on my website, TanyaKnits.com. Okay, and another question from Michelle. Can you please do a video on keeping the edges neat when knitting plain and in pattern? So I'm not going to do a whole video about it. There's quite a few online already, and I'm going to link to 3 different ones that I found that I thought were very helpful. And I'm not sure what exactly you're referring to, but I'm going to go with the assumption that you're talking about like you have uneven tension on the edges, which can make them look a little sloppier than the rest of your knitting. Or if you have like what they call rowing out, where you've got like gaps between rows, which is more evident in like stockinette stitch, because generally everybody either knits tighter than they purl, or they purl tighter than they knit. It can vary depending on if you knit with your yarn in your right hand or with your yarn in your left. My problem personally, when I did a lot of checking to see which one was causing me the most trouble, I hold the yarn in my left hand, but it wasn't my purl that was looser, it was actually my knit, because the way I use my second finger to control the yarn when I'm purling, and I have a tendency to pull down as I'm making the stitch, which makes them slightly tighter than my knit stitches. I don't have that problem on the knit row, where I don't give that little pull on the yarn. So those actually end up looser than my purl stitches. So, but that, I mean, that's the foundation. You have to figure out which stitch is causing you the trouble. And I think Suzanne Ryan had a class where she did a survey of the people that were in the class, and those who knit with their right hand, in general, their problem was a tight purl stitch or a tight knit stitch. I can't remember now. And then if they knit with the yarn in their right hand, it was opposite. It was their knit stitch that was too tight, I think. I don't remember. But anyway, so we're going to go with the assumption that you're talking about either sort of like the edges are rowing out, or you have, like, one of my other issues was I would start very tight and then I would slowly get looser and looser. So when I would look at like whatever I was knitting, the right side was tight and the left side was like they weren't the same length, because all of your your yarn is moving across from the row below, and if there's excess yarn, it's sort of moving across as well, and that can make that issue worse. So I had to learn to like not be so tight at the beginning and tighten up on the end. The problem is that this is really specific to your type of knitting, like how you hold the yarn, how you tension the yarn, like which fingers you use. Like I had no idea, because the way I was using my second finger to slightly pull on the purl stitches, that I was making them tighter than the knit stitches. So there are different ways to fix these things, but it's hard to diagnose without knowing how you actually knit. But you could also be, so like I had that issue with relaxing. So the first thing I would say is like really pay attention to what you're doing, not just the yarn and the needles, but what are your hands doing? How far are you pushing the needle in to make the stitch? Are you working them on the both barrels of the needle? You're making the stitches too large. You should be working them on the tips or the taper. That's when we talk about the tips and the taper. We've got that tapered point. That's where you should be working the stitch. And then use your right needle to size the stitch so it's not too big or too small. But the first thing I would do is pay attention. Look at your hands. Are they doing any sort of small maneuvers that are making things tighter or looser, depending on the knit or the purl, or if you're at the beginning of the row or the end of the row. Oh yes, I had a note here about, I know we like to have like mindless knitflix knitting, and which is nice because you just want to knit and relax. But sometimes you have to look at what you're doing, and to really improve what you're doing, you have to pay attention to how your hands move, how they hold the yarn. So the fix, I feel bad even trying to answer this because there isn't really a fix, because I don't know what your particular issue is. So instead, I'm going to link to 3 different videos. Very Pink Knits has one on edge tension, and she talks about a lot of different issues in that. Suzanne Bryan has one called Fixing Messy Edge Stitches, and she takes a really scientific approach to fixing these things, and I find it really fascinating. But this is just one of the videos where she talks about tension. And then Roxanne Richardson also has one about troubleshooting loose or messy edges, and her as well. She gets very particular about the fixes. So I'm going to link to all 3 of those. And if you have an issue, if you look at your knitting and you see, like edges look messy, or for me, it was my right edge was shorter than my left edge, which was always longer. And it was because of the way I was knitting. I was starting out tight and then just getting looser. And then I had to really think about that and make some changes to the way I knit to adjust that. And at first it can feel strange trying to fix these things, but it does become part of your muscle memory as you learn to apply these fixes. The more you do them, the easier they become, and then you don't have to think about them anymore. So if that's something you want to work on, then go check out those videos. And one more question from Stitch in Which. I keep thinking about going for my Master Knitter certification, but I keep hesitating, unsure of the cost and if it's worth the time. I'd love to hear what you wish you'd known before starting the process. So I can't tell you if it's worth the time or the cost for you. It's really a personal decision. It's not something I can say is that something that every knitter should do, because I think it would kill the joy of knitting for quite a few knitters. But for those knitters who like to explore their knitting and understand how it works or why it works the way it does, or really want to improve their skills, or if they want to become a designer, well, they also offer a design course too now. But if you just want to really improve, like really vastly improve, then this is the course for you. But if you think it would kill your love of knitting, then don't do it. But they have other courses if you think you'd like to be a sample knitter, or like a test knitter with like lots of good experience to show that you have the skills. They have a course for that as well, which is different from this. The Master Hand Knitting program requires a lot of research, and they don't hand you papers and tell you read these and fill out some questions. They give you the questions and tell you go do your research and answer these questions. The other programs usually provide the materials for you, so you're not having to do the research. But to answer your question about what I wish I'd known before starting, the big thing for me was thinking about how I was I was very scared of the process. I think that's why I did their basics course first, because the thought of they're going to judge my work and they're going to hate it and I'm going to fail and have to do everything all over again. I'm sure I'm not the only one who probably thought that, and that's not the case. Even with level 2, my vest, there were a lot of critical comments about the vest that I did. They didn't make me redo it, but I had to apply not apply the mistakes. I had to take their critiques and apply it to some of the swatches that I'd also messed up, but they really related to the vest itself. Now, I'm not saying they're not going to make you reknit projects. I've had to reknit the wristlet in the 2nd level, but if that's something that concerns you, then take the basics course first, and that will give you an idea of the sort of feedback you're going to get. And I think you have to have not a thick skin, but you have to be willing to take some criticism, and don't take it personally, that they're there to help you improve your knitting. So they're not going to say, oh, it's all wonderful and no mistakes. We all make mistakes. It's hand knitting. It's not going to be perfect. And they will point those mistakes out to you. But what's funny is the things that I thought would get pointed out and I'd have to redo, I did not have to redo. The things that I thought I had done well, I usually messed up and had to redo. But what it taught me was that I needed to learn how to evaluate my own work. And I think that's another skill that, you develop as you go, but it's something to be aware of at the beginning, is look at your knitting now. Do you have gutters along the edges, or you have weird tension issues? Then start learning how to deal with them. Do some research, do some Google searches, go on YouTube. There are lots of people, Suzanne Bryan, Roxanne Richardson, they're both master knitters, have been for a long time. And they share lots of tips and advice and techniques to improve the actual knitted fabric you create. That's probably one of the biggies, is they just want to know that you can take their feedback and apply it and improve your knitting. But you have to be able to look at your knitting to see what needs to be improved. So that's a skill I wish I had known I was going to need, because I learned it now, but way back at the beginning, I didn't know that. So start taking a critical look at your knitting to see what tension issues you should start dealing with, and start doing some research and practicing and improving those. And with each level, you get when your level comes back, you have a pretty thick letter, walks through each of the things and tells you, it'll just say pass if you passed, if everything was good, or it might have little notes about it, or it will give you some critiques and some compliments about the things that you will have to resubmit. And level 1, I didn't have a ton to resubmit. Level 2, I had to resubmit, I think, all of the seaming swatches because my seams were terrible, and they're better now. I've practiced a lot. But even, with some of the things, if you have one that's you've messed it up completely, you'll have to redo it. But if it's something that shows up sometimes in different swatches, you might not have to redo all of the swatches. You might just have to redo a few to show that you have improved in that area. So I think it's more of it's the unknown. You don't know what's going to happen. You're spending all of this money on this course and all of this time just to find out that everything's absolutely terrible. So if that's a concern, start looking at your own work and being critical of your own work and how you can improve, and take some time to start working on tension issues. And they have a little mini course, I think it's called Taming Tension, that has lots of fixes and shows you what to look for. That might be another thing to look at. I think that was my last note on here. It was, yes, learn to self-evaluate your work. And then the writing and research, there is a lot of it. I've heard it called, though, this is the master's. If you're going to go to college, this would be a college level course to do these 3 levels. And it is, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of writing. So that's something to be aware of. If you don't want to do all of that, then you're not going to want to do this course. But it can feel overwhelming, but I would break it up. With this last level, I had 4 magazine reviews. Oh no, 2 magazines, 2 books. I can't even remember now because I did them last year. But I had a list of everything that I had to do, and they give you a checklist with everything. And I would say, okay, this week I'm going to work on this. And then I would get that done. And then the next week I'm going to work on this. And then even the swatches are divided up into groups. like in level 1, I think you've got like a certain number of increase swatches and then you have a certain number of decrease swatches. So I would focus, okay, I'm going to do like however many increase swatches there were, say 3. I'm just going to do those this week or this 2 weeks. Just work on those swatches and their swatch information sheets. So you just really focus on one thing at a time and just, it's like that old joke, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Same thing with the master's program. How do you finish it? One swatch at a time. So I hope that answers your question. But if you do want to improve your knitting, but you don't want to do all of that writing and research, then their sample knitter, or I can't remember what the name of it is. It's sort of the alternative to the master hand knitting program where you can work on your knitting skills without having to do all of the research and the writing. They provide everything you need. You have to show that you can improve your knitting, work to deadlines, because the goal is that you will use your skills to become a sample knitter for like a yarn company or designer or something like that. So there are other alternatives to this program. So let's go on to our fiber of the week, our knitting discussion. We have talked about animal fibers, we have talked about plant fibers, and we're wrapping up with one more plant fiber, and not a very common one, but I did find a few yarns that you can buy to try this one out, and some links below so you can see the process of seaweed being harvested, because yes, there is yarn made from seaweed. It's called Seacell, and it can be from seaweed and from eucalyptus, or I think maybe even other wood pulp, or I didn't find much information, so I'm going to share what I have, but it's so they take the seaweed, it's washed and it's dried, carefully ground, and it's incorporated into this cellulose fiber, usually from another wood source. And then they have a wide variety of textiles, including yarn. Now, it's manufactured like lyocell, which is a form of rayon. We talked about this a few weeks ago when we talked about bamboo, how that's a form of rayon. Basically, they all have the same sort of manufacturing process, and Seacell, or this seaweed-based yarn, falls within that process. So it uses the same process as bamboo, rayon, and viscose yarns. Now, the fiber is produced exclusively from sustainable raw materials, the wood and the seaweed, using methods that save both energy and resources, so it's completely biodegradable. And harvesting the seaweed is gentle, selective, and most importantly, sustainable. It removes only the part of the seaweed that is able to regenerate, and the seaweed is entirely untreated and all its ecological value is retained. So I did a little bit of research about like how much seaweed is included in the yarn itself, because it's a combination of some sort of cellulose wood like eucalyptus. And it's actually a pretty small amount. It's like, what did I say? It's washed, dried, carefully ground up, and then incorporated into this cellulose fiber. So you're not going to find like 100% seaweed yarn. It's incorporated into one of these forms of rayon, basically. And it's not even a very big amount, but it does provide some advantages. It's a non-allergenic, antibacterial, absorbent, very soft, light and breathable, strong, and has a slight sheen. So the things that it has in common are very similar to all of the advantages of other rayon, wood pulp based yarns. It sounds weird to know that yarn comes from wood pulp. I don't know. But you'll find it blended with other plant fibers, or it's very commonly found with silk. So I don't really have recommendations about what patterns to look for because I've never knit with this fiber, but I would assume that because it's combined with like a rayon type material, that it would use it in a similar manner to other plant fibers because they have a lot of those same characteristics. So if you have a pattern that uses a plant fiber yarn and you happen to have a yarn that uses Seacell, then it might be a good alternative. It's also combined with silk. I found two, the Handmaiden Sea Silk and then Sweet Georgia Sea Silk Lace. So it's blended with the silk in it, so it has the sheen and the drape. So if you're knitting a shawl or something like that, then it could be good for something like that. There isn't really much to say about it because I've never knit with it and there's not as much information about this type of yarn, but it is interesting to see. So our next discussion is going to be covering synthetic fibers and what you need to know about knitting with those. So be back next week and we'll start that discussion. Now, before I start discussing what I've been knitting, I just want to share about this week's sponsor, which is Knit Picks, and two of the sales they have going right now. They're still having a sale on their fixed circular needles, and I mentioned it before how much I like fixed circulars for certain projects. So if you're looking to add a few to your collection, then you can save 20% on fixed circular needles from Knit Picks. And they're also having save up to 30% on their Aloft yarn, which is a blend of Super Kid mohair and silk. So if you love those projects where you're combining like one of those fuzzy yarns with another yarn, then this is a good time to stock up on their yarn because you can save up to 30%. So my knitting, first off, the Master Hand Knitting Program Level 3 is off in the mail today. My husband took the box with him to work and he's going to drop it off at the post office today of recording. So I don't expect to hear back about that probably until July. So I've got a nice little break from that for a little bit, which is nice because I have sped through the three levels. Not really sped, but I started them in 2018. So 18, 21, 20. So 4 years it's taken me to complete the 3 levels, which is pretty quick, I think. Not that I'm done yet. I'm still gonna have that box come back and I'll have things to resubmit and hopefully be completely done. Maybe have my Master Knitter certification by Christmas. I would hope. We'll see, fingers crossed. So that is officially out the door. So it feels strange not to have that to think about, but I've got lots of other things on my needles, designs and things that I'm knitting for myself and friends and family. So, and trying to think about what I want to tackle next because knitting is research for me. So anyway, it's out the door now and I can take a little bit to breathe and relax. So on my needles right now is my daughter's cardigan. I'm working on the sleeves now, 2 at a time. Got the ribbing all done for the cuff. It's a 3-inch cuff, nice long cuff. And I've got my increases going very slowly, but yes, focusing on those sleeves. So the back is done, the sides are done, just these to finish. And then I'm going to at least get the 2 front pieces blocked and see how that works out before I decide if I'm going to bother with the back. And then it's a process of seaming it up. And then I've got the collar to pick up and knit, and it's going to be a shawl collar, which I think I've knit one before, sort of on the fly, and it didn't come out well, but I hadn't planned well for it either. And then patch pockets as well, which will be a new thing too. I haven't done those before. So it's based on a pattern not a pattern, but a character in an anime she watches. She just likes the sweater he wears. So it's the same, very close color, so it's almost an exact match. So she can add it to her cosplay things that she likes to wear. I'm using a pattern from Amy Herzog's Ultimate Sweater Book. This is a great resource if you like lots of plain patterns that you can add things yourself. This design right here, the set in sleeve cardigan, comes in 3 different yarn weights, 12 different sizes. I'm doing the sport weight yarn. I'm using Knit Picks Brava sport weight. And yep, it's coming along nicely. The pattern is very easy to follow, but it's very brief if you're familiar with Ann Budd's books, their handy book of sweater patterns. Then you'll probably recognize like it uses lots of charts. So you just find your gauge and your size and you just follow the numbers on that. It's very similar to that. Like you just have the chart like that. It's just find your numbers and follow along, but she also includes lots of design information. So like I'm doing this sweater it's a set and sleeve sweater, but she really talks you through, like she gives you these basic patterns, but she walks you through how to construct it yourself. Like if you want to draft the sweater, then like how to draft a sleeve cap, which is not for the faint of heart. I haven't tried that yet. Oh, that's not showing up very well. Let's see if I can put it over here. There. So there's also the design element in here as well. If you don't want to follow her numbers and you want to design from scratch, then that's here. And it's a really great resource. I think I mentioned last week, if you had like a stitch dictionary or 2 and this book, you could knit all the sweaters that you wanted to do. And I am working on a shawl design. This is in Gauge Dye Works. Whiskey in a Teacup is the colorway, and it's on their 2-ply fingering base. It has this fun color change yarn. I am working on this final section. I mentioned it last week. I have not done anything with it since then because I have not made up my mind yet about what to do right here. I'm thinking about taking this whole gray section out and just doing like just garter stitch with lots of big eyelets, like wrap the yarn twice or maybe even 3 times to get really big eyelet holes. So I think I might rip this out and try that and see how it looks, because I'm not in love with, it's all right, but I feel like I need something else for this one. Not to, so it won't be exactly like 100% the same as the top-down triangle shawl. Even though the shape is different, the stitch patterns are the same. So I wanted something a little bit different. So I think I might change this gray section. So I'm thinking of garter stitch with eyelets and then finishing with a picot edge. So I don't know. Designing on the fly is very different than like planning it out first, because I didn't plan this out first. I just sort of, if it doesn't work out, I rip it out and then try something else. And that's what I've been doing. And so far, I haven't quite fallen in love with anything on here. But the first in this Color Adventure shawl will be out in June. And I have no idea when this one will come out. We will see if I'm going to self-publish or submit it somewhere. But it's no progress since last week. But so if you haven't weighed in on your thoughts about what to do here, if you like the idea of lots of big eyelets, or if you think I should keep it the same, maybe more textured stuff and then the picot edge, not sure. I haven't decided. Making very good progress on my father-in-law's fingerless mitts. I have one all finished, and then one that is almost finished. I just have the final ribbing to do and the thumb, and I'm doing a tubular edge on the bind off and on the cast on. So I forgot to go down a needle size, but I don't think it looks terrible on there. I do like a tubular edge. It looks nice. So that one is finished, and then when the other one's finished, I've got to work out how I'm going to do the convertible top to add that, but that should be an easy process. I think I'm just going to do like cast on half the stitches using the tubular cast on, and then pick up the stitches right here, and then I can knit the top in the round like you would a standard mitten. I think we'll see. There's other ways to work them as well, with short rows, like a short row toe in a sock. I've seen that one. Or maybe even knit the whole thing first and then sew it on. But I don't know. We shall see which method I end up using. This is using Jamieson and Smith, their 2-ply jumper weight in this moss green color. And it took almost a full skein for just the one mitten. Not quite, because I did do a gauge swatch of about that big. So, but it took, yeah. So it's going to take most of this yarn, I think, to, well, I probably should maybe have half a skein left at least. We'll see after the tops are done. But that's coming along really well. And last week I talked about this yarn I had left, all from knitting the Fair Isle Tam. You can see one of the swatches or one of the hats there for my master's program. So I could save that in case I have to reknit the hat. But part of me wants to use it. And I had chosen 2 patterns last week, and then I didn't realize one of them was for sport weight yarn, so it sort of canceled itself out. So I purchased the other pattern, the Trondheim mittens. But after, I didn't weigh my yarn first, and I should have, because the 2 main colors, I don't have enough of either one, so I'm going to have to buy a whole new skein, which means that I wanted to use up my leftovers, and I'm not really. Like, I'd have to buy more yarn to knit the mittens because I don't have enough, and I wouldn't actually use the leftovers, except for a little bit for the cuff. So it's back to the drawing board to see how I want to use up this yarn. I do have some little like Advent mittens. I haven't knit them in 2 years. They're in a bag back there in the basket. That unfinished project pile. I think I only have like 3 left, and I had used up all my leftover little bits for those. So I don't know if I want to knit like a whole new set of those. I should have enough for that, maybe. I don't know. Maybe not. I don't know. So I'm back to the drawing board. I'm going to save that pattern. It was for the Trondheim mittens. I really like them. I think they're cute. I'm just going to have to wait until I actually want to buy the yarn for them, because I don't have enough, but I want to use the yarn I have. Isn't that always the conundrum? You try to use up the yarn you have, and then you have to buy more to finish the thing, and then you still have more to use up. It's like a never-ending cycle. So it's back to the drawing wheel. I have all of this yarn, but none of them full skeins, like about 35 grams for some, 25 grams of others, of all these beautiful colors. I just can't figure out what to make with them. I suppose I could make another hat. But anyway, so if you've got any ideas for me, I want to knit something for myself. I really like these colors. Now it's time to get a little bit nerdy, and we have been talking about stitch dictionaries. We started last week. I shared some of my favorites, and this week I wanted to share a few more. These books by Wendy Bernard. Yes, Wendy Bernard, author of the Custom Knits series. I have one of those books on my shelf too. Now these are really fun. You're going to see some overlap. If you have the Barbara Walker books, you'll see some of those patterns in here. But what I like about these is that, let me see this one. Okay, here's one right here. You've got the picture of the swatch, you've got the written instructions and the charts. But what makes it really interesting is that you get instructions based on the direction of the knitting. So you would, if the stitch pattern requires different instructions depending on the direction, you'll get a chart for top down, bottom up, in the round, or flat knitting. All the charts are there, so you don't have to convert it yourself. I mean, it's possible. You can take a chart from Barbara Walker, like that's knit flat, and convert it for in the round or something like that. But she does all of the work for you in this book, which is really nice. So here's one called Chevron Bands. You get the picture of the swatch, and then the instructions for flat knitting and in the round knitting. So it's really nice if you like to have the charts all done for you. That's the thing with the Barbara Walker books, at least the first two. The third is supposed to be a charted book. I have not seen that one. But if you prefer working from charts and you despise working from written instructions, then you might prefer these. And they are nice that it's all worked out for you, like flat, in the round, top down, bottom up, all of that. And I think she's got a third book about Japanese knitting stitches, but it's not my favorite. But I've got like 3 or 4 Japanese knitting stitch dictionaries on my shelf. We'll talk about them next week. So it's not my favorite, but it does sort of fit within these. So there's the up, down, all around and the knitting all around stitch dictionaries. And they're nice hardcover books, but they've got that coil binding. So they lay flat, which is nice. If you want to like swatch right from the book, then it's really nice for that. And you can see like my Barbara Walker, I do have them tabbed up here for quick reference, because sometimes if I know I'm working on a particular design and I want to say like it's going to have cables, then I can just flip right to the cables. So if you are looking to invest in some stitch dictionaries, then these are 2 that I do recommend. There's a lot of great stitch patterns in here, and edgings as well. One of them has edgings, which is nice. A nice addition, I think. I think the Barbara Walker books do as well, but you can see there's some examples of the ways to finish something, like a little ruffle or this little feather and fan edge. So along with the edgings and up, down, all around, there are knits and purls, ribs, textured and slipped, yarn over an eyelet, cables, lace, color, and the edgings. And then in the knitting all around book, you've got knits and purls, ribs, twisted and slipped, cables, lace, and this one has mosaics. So they're not quite the same, and they've got completely different stitch patterns in both books. But if you have Barbara Walker books, then you will see some crossover between the 2. But these are another 2 that you could add to your shelf if you're a designer, or if you just like to change stitch patterns in designs, or if you like to take a plain sweater and add a stitch pattern. Like I said last week, you could have this book, 1 or 2 stitch dictionaries, and you could make plenty of sweaters. So that's all for this episode of the Nerdy Knitting Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you again next week. If you're new here, then I'll put a playlist right here. You can click right there and watch past episodes of this season's podcast episodes. I feel like I said episodes a lot right there. But thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next video.